Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to welcome Timothy Garton to tell us today what kind of Europe is likely to emerge from the COVID crisis. Professor Timothy Garton is a professor of European Studies at the University of Oxford. He's also a professorial fellow at St. Anthony's College, which is my old college, and senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University in California. Timothy Garton is one of the leading European public intellectuals. He is a prolific writer. He has written many books and articles, and he also has a very strong presence in the mass media. He combines the depth of a historian with very good knowledge of current affairs. And his special expertise is on Germany and the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. I notice in the title he proposed for today's discussion that he has chosen the word kairos, keros in Greek, in front of the title, which I presume means that Timothy is going to challenge the status quo. So, Timothy, it's a very great pleasure to have you here today with us virtually, better than nothing. And we look forward to hearing from you, or rather listening to you. Timothy.
Well, thank you very much, Loukas, and it's lovely to be with you in this virtual Delphi. And indeed, that is what I want to do, to argue that in this crisis, there may be a kairos, a moment of opportunity. So I would say that even before COVID hit, we had at least 8 big challenges to the European project. Externally, relations with the United States, China, Russia, and climate change. Internally, Brexit, the North-South divide inside the Eurozone, the West-East with the erosion of democracy in countries like Poland and Hungary, and last but not least, the existential challenge of whether a sufficient majority of Europeans are persuaded of the value of the European project going forward. And what I want to argue is that the COVID crisis could potentially exacerbate every single one of these, but it could also, and here's the kairos, be an opportunity for taking a much better term on many, though not all of these. So I'm going to go through them very, very quickly, and then we can get into conversation. United States, clearly, to have another 4 years of Donald Trump in a United States as divided, as polarized, as angry, and as weak as it is at the moment, a disaster for Europe. The silver lining, the opportunity, is that Trump's mishandling of this crisis and the economic consequences are so visible that there's a good chance we'll have a different American president, President Biden. So on the US, possible silver lining. China, the biggest geopolitical challenge of the next 10 to 20 years, bar none. The immediate effect is clearly to exacerbate the problem. Namely, in perhaps slightly surprising fashion, it has catapulted us further forward into what I think is quite safe to call a new Cold War between China and the United States. And the difference from the first Cold War is that at the beginning of the first Cold War, it was Western Europe trying to get the United States involved in Europe against the Soviet Union. Here, a much richer and more powerful Europe is, as we say in English, piggy in the middle, is caught between the two, a real dilemma for Europeans. The opportunity that is hidden somewhere in there, if we had a new US administration, is, I think, that it's focused European minds on the need to have a new strategy for China, which has to be, as in the period of détente, a twin-track strategy. Clear lines of containment, South China Seas, Taiwan, interference in our domestic politics, our universities, our media, but continued constructive engagement. And there's just a chance that we could reforge a strategy which, to be effective, would have to be not just Europe, but also the US and the UK. Russia, I can be very quick. Most people have forgotten about Russia, forgotten that in 2014, Putin's Russia seized by force part of the sovereign territory of another neighboring country. The effect of the COVID crisis, at least so far as I can foresee, is significantly to weaken Putin's Russia, partly because he's handled it very badly, but mainly because the oil price has gone through the floor. And since Putin's Russia is a petro state, it actually has weakened Russia. So arguably, we'll have less of a problem on the Russian front. Climate change, as I'm sure many people have been saying, I see as a real moment of opportunity. Number one, through the fact that our energy consumption has gone right down in the lockdown, people have actually begun to appreciate how nice it is to have clean air and clear skies. I've never seen so many people on bicycles as I have in the last couple of months. In the last 2 months, Britain has consumed no electricity produced by coal, none, no coal-based electricity. So people have begun to see the virtues of the environment, but also, of course, the scale of the economic recovery plan gives Europe the chance to accelerate progress towards the Green New Deal, to build the greening of Europe into the recovery plan. And I regard that as a great opportunity also because we've done out of my research project at Oxford quite a lot of polling among young Europeans. Absolutely top of their list of priorities is climate change. Turning to the internal ones, again in telegraphic brevity, and then we can talk about them in greater depth. Brexit, bad news. It seems to me quite clear that the Johnson government has now effectively decided to get out coûte que coûte at the end of this year with a minimal deal if they can get it, but otherwise with no deal. And the cynical political calculation about this, cynical but quite clever, is to conceal the damage done by Brexit behind the economic damage done by COVID. And while that may not be plausible in particular sectors, in the big picture, it's quite a clever political strategy. There is also the calculation that since the Johnson government is anyway going for a fairly minimal deal, the difference between that deal and no deal is not so large. And if we're going to restructure our economy post-COVID, we don't want to be encumbered with the level playing field that Barnier and the EU is demanding. Now, that may be a mistaken calculation, but that is the calculation being made. And I think that's bad news for Europe as a whole, because it means a much more fractious and distant relationship with the UK, which will have spillover effects on other areas like climate change, China, and security policy, right? So that's the bad news. North-South, you know Loukas better than anyone, and people in Greece know, this seems to me the biggest piece of good news so far out of the crisis. To an extent I had not anticipated. The Franco-German initiative on the European Recovery Plan, the Commission's more ambitious target, is already a very impressive response. Now, you know better than anyone, the devil is in the detail. We'll see how much is agreed on June the 19th. Clearly, there will be compromises to be made. Then the great question is, will the stuff be delivered to the right places, particularly in Southern Europe, in time? That's all true. Nonetheless, this is a very encouraging development. And what I want to emphasize is one point. What it marks is a really enormous shift specifically in the German, which I absolutely would not have anticipated. Politically, COVID has given Angela Merkel, who is now supreme, firmly in the saddle until autumn next year, has given her the opportunity and imperative of doing things that she would not otherwise have done, i.e. disbursement by grants and in effect a certain mutualization of debt. But more important, behind that, there's a beginning of a new consensus among German economists, even in the finance ministry, that this is what we need to do. If you read yesterday's FT, the deputy finance minister says a monetary union needs a fiscal union. This is like the Pope suddenly advocating divorce. I mean, it's the most extraordinary thing to hear from inside the German finance ministry. So even if there are problems in the delivery, I think that's a really significant shift. However, on the East-West front, namely the dramatic erosion of democracy in Poland and Hungary, the fact that, Loukas, I would say, Hungary today, under the special emergency legislation, is a dictatorship. Think of that for a moment. We have a dictatorship that is a member state of the European Union. Jean Monnet once said in the early 1970s, you can't have a dictatorship inside the EU. We've got one. And Poland is going very fast in the same direction. Now, here my concern is this. What should happen is that, well, first of all, Fidesz is kicked out of the EPP, which is the most important single thing to happen fast. But secondly, that in the new 7-year MFF, multi-year financial framework, we have much clearer linkage between transparency and rule and law on the one hand, and disbursements of EU money on the other hand. Because at the moment, Boris Johnson famously said his attitude to cake is, my attitude to cake is one should have it and eat it. It's called cakeism. The result is Johnson is neither having his cake nor eating it. But the person who's having his cake and eating it is Viktor Orban. He is both solidifying his authoritarian regime, hybrid authoritarian regime, and paying for that solidification with EU funds. The EU is feeding the hand that bites it. That's what should happen. My fear is that the effect of COVID plus the north-south dimension of the recovery plan is actually that the EU will not take effective action on that, starting on June the 19th, where in order to get Poland and Hungary on board for what, after all, has to be unanimous support, I think that the EU is going to go soft on that. And I think that's already the tendency from the Commission. So that's rather a negative note. Final one, the existential crisis, which of course is the biggest of all. In a recent opinion poll in Italy, 42% of those asked said they thought Italy should leave the EU. In Italy, a founding member of the EU, there really is an existential crisis in popular support for the European project. Here at Oxford, we're concentrating particularly on young Europeans with their priorities, which are climate change, freedom of movement, jobs and social security, and to some extent, global engagement, right? Here I see the biggest kairos, the possibility that European leadership, if it's imaginative and strong and strategic, can actually knit together these various positive initiatives I've been talking about and turning it into a narrative about the crisis becoming an opportunity for Europe. So von der Leyen's great plan is called Next Generation EU. The question is this actually going to be an EU that persuades and makes sense to the next generation? And that's where I see the opportunity. So just to sum up and then to go into the conversation, of my 8 points, I guess 2 to 3 are probable negatives. Brexit's a negative, East-West a negative, China a probable negative, certainly a large question mark. But on several of the other ones, there's a real chance that if we get the right kind of leadership, the right kind of strategy, Europe could actually emerge stronger.
Timothy, thank you very much. That was an impressive tour d'horizon, and I would have very little to disagree with. But let me play devil's advocate. Let me start with foreign policy. You spoke about relations with the United States, China, and Russia. The problem with Europe, as you know very well, is that Europe has always been, at best, a soft power, exercising its power in terms of trade, in terms of economic aid, in terms of standard setting, and so on and so forth. When it comes to high politics, the traditional area of foreign policy, Europeans have found it extremely difficult to reach a united stance on virtually anything of importance. And if one concentrates on US, Russia, and China, I think all three powers, and I include the United States under Trump, have been playing divide and rule with members of the European Union, and they have been playing successfully the divide and rule game. What makes you think that in the foreseeable future, Trump or no Trump, the Europeans will be able to unite on very fundamental, almost issues of existential matter in terms of relations with Russia, the emerging power of China, or a United States that even without Trump is going to be a United States that will have much less interest in Europe than it had in the past, and also a United States that may be tempted more often than not to divide and rule. What do you think?
It's a great challenge, and a great challenge. And of course, remember that my bottom line on that was a question mark / possible negative. One first thing to say, and you know this very well, is that if you want to see the EU at its worst, you look at it from Beijing, from Washington, or from Moscow, from the capital of a great power. So actually, it looks much, much better if you look at it from Africa or from smaller countries in Southeast Asia. So that's point number one. Point number two, of the big three you mentioned, let me take them in turn. Of course, you're right about Trump. I think that if you look at the people around Biden and you make a rational assessment of where the US would be on January 20th next year, you would say we actually need to repair the strategic partnership with Europe. For example, to take on the Chinese challenge, right? You need European cooperation in order to take on the Chinese challenge. Russia, the fact is that we kept unity on sanctions post-2014, even though there were huge differences between member states. So we did actually achieve a significant level of unity. Faced with a weakened Russia, I think it's possible that we could at least maintain that minimal level of unity. That leaves China, which is the big one, and I do agree that with China, which is very effectively playing divide and rule, particularly if we have a weak economic recovery, particularly in Southern Europe, there's going to be lots more opportunities for China. So mine is a very cautious optimism on that front.
If I may press you a little bit more on this subject, my fear is, I may be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong, that irrespective of who is the president of the United States is going to adopt a much more confrontational attitude towards China, a confrontational attitude that many Europeans may not want to share, or at least go as far as a US president would like them to go. So the Europeans are likely to be faced with very awkward choices in the next few years. Do you think this is not a realistic scenario?
Well, on that very point, Mike Pompeo yesterday issued a most extraordinary press statement, which was denouncing China's coercion of the United Kingdom, a statement which, in effect, was waving a finger at the United Kingdom. The target of the statement was the United Kingdom, not of China. So you're absolutely right. I use the term Cold War advisedly. However, I think that there's a growing understanding in Europe itself that there is a genuine Chinese challenge to our digital infrastructure, for example, to academic freedom, to media freedom. Hong Kong has certainly had quite a big impact, I think, not just in Britain. So that I think that independently of the US stance, we are likely to see a hardening of the European approach to China. And the question is not, do we achieve identical positions? The question is, can we get close to what we had for most of the Cold War, particularly in the détente period, which is a kind of tense, awkward division of labor between Europe and the United States, but which ultimately was very effective because you had more American stick and more European carrot, but they were broadly speaking working in the same direction. So I would agree with you that my analysis, would be skeptical on the prospects of that. But I think there is a possibility, if we have a very, very deliberate, intense European strategic discussion.
Okay. Let's move to the next subject, which is Brexit. I fully share your concern about the prospects. Brexit cannot deny geography and cannot deny history. Britain is and will remain a European country, part of the European continent. And I've been hoping that realism will prevail in the end, and we're going to establish the basis for a special relationship. So if marriage has failed, let us try an extramarital close affair between the UK and the rest of Europe, if you can imagine this.
The English are traditionally not very good at that,
Okay. I'm influenced by my teaching in Paris. So if Brexit goes wrong, and if indeed we end up by the end of the year with a minimal relationship based on WTO rules and nothing more than that, do we have to wait for a new government in the UK before we can think of improvement? Or what are the prospects? The cost is going to be high, and so will be the political cost and economic cost.
So the bad news is, I think that's what's likely to happen, and the fallout will be very considerable. And I mean, my only advice to friends and partners in the EU would be to try to play a longer game, because, as you say, Britain is so important to Europe in a larger sense in foreign policy, military security, and so on and so forth, that you simply can't ignore it, even if you want to. Here's the good news. Point number one, there has been a dramatic collapse in trust in the Johnson government because of its highly incompetent handling of the COVID crisis, and specifically the hypocrisy over the affair of Dominic Cummings, which may seem trivial, but it wasn't. I mean, you look at the polls and it's a dramatic collapse. I, in my bones, that's one of those things which is quite difficult for a government to recover from, and particularly a government which is quite incompetent. So although on paper they've got more than 4 years, I think they've got problems of their own. But even better news is, for the first time in a long time, we have a really impressive, sensible, experienced, impressive leader of the Labour Party in Keir Starmer, who, of course, was their spokesman on Brexit, who knows and cares about Europe a great deal. So that for the first time in a long time, we actually have a political alternative in the British domestic political context. And if Starmer carries on as he does now, and Johnson carries on as he does now, the chances of Labour winning the next election, perhaps in some sort of electoral coalition with the Lib Dems, are very good. So that I think, yes, I'm afraid you have to brace yourselves for a really rough patch. But perhaps it is like a marriage. Maybe one can, come through it after all.
Right. Two more subjects before we finish. One, relates to the East-West divide,
Yeah.
and the other to the Macron-Merkel initiative. I suggest that we deal with the difficult one and the more unpleasant one first, and we leave the good one for the end. So would you agree that the East-West divide is now much deeper than the North-South divide in the European Union? And would you recommend Brussels to do with regard to Orban and the Polish government? Right. I think it is a scandal that Orban has remained in the EPP for so long. And the Commission has been very cautious in the way it has handled the Hungarian situation. But what would you recommend we do now?
Well, to your initial proposition, Loukas, I don't think I would agree for this reason, that the region has always been quite differentiated and is now even more differentiated. So that, for example, you have a really pro-European lawyer president of Slovakia. So there's very significant differences, in fact, growing differences between the countries in the region, so that East-West is shorthand, but that has to be borne in mind. Secondly, while I think democracy has been dramatically eroded in Hungary, we actually have still a lot to pay for in Poland. There's still a strong opposition in Poland. A former Europe minister, Rafał Trzaskowski, is now a candidate for president of Poland. It's a long shot, but he's actually doing very well, and the ruling party is running scared. So there are still major forces in Poland, also including lawyers, independent media, civil society, part of the business community, that don't want Poland to continue on this course. So that I wouldn't preclude a political turn in Poland itself. What we should do, two things. First of all, three things actually. All, as you rightly say, as I've said myself for years, it's a scandal that Orban is still, and Fidesz are still effectively part of the EPP, and they should be kicked out tomorrow. Secondly, we should talk about it much more. There's a real danger this whole issue gets almost completely forgotten because of all the other challenges we're facing. Thirdly, what I said in my remarks, a carefully constructed mechanism applying to all member states. This is important because otherwise it looks like double standards. So it applies as much to Greece and Sweden as it does to Poland and Hungary, linking the disbursement of funds to transparency, good governance, and rule of law conditions, right? I don't believe Article 7 is going anywhere. I don't believe the big stick is going to happen because Hungary will veto for Poland and Poland will veto for Hungary, and the EU probably won't get there anyway. But I do believe in such a mechanism is still conceivable, and it really, the money is so important. More than 90% of public investment in Hungary 3 years ago had a component of EU funds. It is an enormous part, not just of structural investment, but actually of the patronage available to the parties in power. So in short, what we have to do is to reconnect the Europe of values to the Europe of money.
Okay, fully agree with that. Now, let's finish with the good news. You spoke about the initiative, joint initiative by President Macron and Chancellor Merkel. It seems to me that this may be a real game changer in European integration. How do you explain this remarkable shift in the official position of the German government? And to what extent do you think that Chancellor Merkel was influenced by the decision of the Constitutional Court in Germany, challenging not only the independence of the ECB, but also the primacy of European law, which is really, I mean, it was a bomb in the foundations of the European project.
Yes, and it really was, and the wording of it too was extremely condescending, it has to be said on top of that. It's a great question, Loukas, and I think it's a really interesting one for historians because, as so often in history, when big events, and I think this is a big event, have a mixture of what one might call structure and process and conjuncture and the role of the individual. So that I think there was a long, slow, attritional process over the last decade of gradually understanding that you had to move beyond the theology of ordoliberalism, the ordoliberal orthodoxy that had been so firmly established in the finance ministry, but also in the economics profession across Germany. And gradually, Olaf Scholz was bringing in new people. You were getting a younger generation of economists coming up. Even moderate Christian Democrats were beginning to understand that something more needed to be done. That's a longer term process. And then you get what Hegel called the cunning of reason in history, the List der Vernunft, because, as you rightly say, the unintended consequence of the Constitutional Court judgment, which was intended, at least on the face of it, to put limits to European action, is actually what finally impelled Angela Merkel, who, and here's the other conjuncture, had been quite weakened, but because of her truly masterly handling of the COVID crisis, was now in an unbelievably strong position, actually pushed her into taking this step. And so it's a wonderful example of the cunning of reason in history, that we get to that point for a mixture of long-term structural processes and chance and the role of the individual.
Okay, I think we have 2 more minutes to conclude. Any final words of wisdom?
Well, I'm very interested here, Loukas, your work yourself on the existential challenges to the European Union. Perhaps I can commend to you our polling, which we did with EU opinions on what Europeans want from the EU, and we're continuing to work on this, and particularly what young Europeans want to work on this. Mm-hmm. And if there's one simple takeaway, is it's not about institutional arrangements. It's Absolutely. Not about procedural legitimacy. They're not interested in that. It's output
Well, nobody
legitimacy. Well, we have some colleagues who are perhaps.
Yeah, sure.
But particularly in this younger age group, it's really very, very telling. The motto has to be on these 4 or 5 big subjects: jobs, social security, climate change, freedoms, including freedom of movement, deliver. So for me, if we started with Kairos, we can end with Nike. The motto for Europe in future should be, just do it.
Okay. That's why I never believed that you could put treaty revisions, which are all about institutions, to popular referenda, because who actually cares about how the European Council or the Council of Ministers take decisions of the European Union? This is a pastime for a very small minority of academics and experts. But Timothy, it was half an hour, 40 minutes of wisdom. Thank you very much indeed for being with us, and look forward to seeing you also live, not only virtual, in the near future.
Well, many thanks, Loukas. It was a great pleasure to talk to you again. And as I say, I hope to see you in a real Delphi, not just a virtual one.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right.